Hey everybody, this is Perch, and I'm here again with Joe. How are you doing?
I'm all right, Perch. How are you?
And I'm doing well, and the cool part is we're here again with Jim. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. We couldn't cover enough last time, it seems, in our first conversation. So
I want to say thank you for coming on again, talking some more. A lot of people really enjoyed that show, and I think it just your insight was great. And this time we're going to get into some other stuff. So this is great.
Yeah. I'm really excited to chat. It's so weird because so much of what I've done is sword and sorcery, and we barely talked about it last time, which is kind of funny.
What if we jumped into that? How did you get into like sword and sorcery, Dungeons and Dragons, like even before you started writing?
Right. So are either of you guys D&D people? Do you read fantasy stuff?
Unfortunately, I would say lapsed. It's been a while.
It's been a little bit for me, but I was the founding member and first president of the Hofstra University Gamers. So,
awesome.
but yeah, like I've played a bunch of D&D and other different systems, GURPS, and
all
big
kinds
in
of
college, and then work in life.
Nice. I am a lifelong gamer. I've been playing since I was 8 years old. So, and I know that very specifically because on the original Dungeons and Dragons Red Box, it says like 10 and up. And my older brother was like, "This is too old for you," because that's what 12-year-olds do, right? Like just torture their younger brothers or whatever. But it became, honestly, between that and fantasy novels and reading Conan comics, like, sword and sorcery was really a really big part of my formative years, and then eventually the Marvel superhero stuff as well. But fantasy kind of predates a bunch of that in a lot of ways. And we, my brother and I, really, as dorky as it sounds, but it's not, it was our kind of shared way of communicating. 4 years doesn't seem like a big gap when you're older, but when 8 and 12, it's like he's almost a teenager. He doesn't want anything to do with me or whatever. And it was like D&D was our shared way of spending time and getting along with each other and my older cousins. And then eventually a lot of friendships through high school and into college and stuff like that. So love tabletop role-playing games, lifelong fan, been playing like crazy, and really voracious reader of the novels and the comic stuff as well. So it's like kind of baked into me now how much I love that stuff. And yet, the fantasy comics kind of in North America have been kind of on and off over the years. Like sometimes it does pretty good. And, Savage Sword of Conan and the original Conan the Barbarian series did well for quite a long time. But then after its star kind of faded, there wasn't a lot to take its place. Like, yes, there was ElfQuest and there were other books and they were fine, but you wouldn't call them, they weren't like world beaters, you know what I mean, in terms of sales or whatever.
Do you think, I'm curious because I just talked to Tom Krajewski a couple days ago, and we were talking about kids into comics and everything else. And what I hear a lot from, I think, people our age and stuff, I was the same way at 8, reading all the sci-fi books, big into the Star Wars books, all the novels that I was consuming, all that. I liked, the most fun part of Dungeons and Dragons for me was researching everything they could do more than playing. Like,
the collector mentality.
I liked reading through all that and all that. And that's your path as well. I mean, that used to be a very common path for people to get into comics at that age. And kind of in chatting with him, did something happen in like the last 20 years where you don't seem to have that?
I mean, you could say there are similarities in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. Like that was a way in for a lot of people. Reading about the characters was in some ways, I wouldn't say more than the books, but almost on the same level. Because particularly when trade paperbacks were not easily accessible, or even a format in a lot of ways, back issues were exorbitantly expensive to a kid. Being able to read like the official handbook was a way to kind of understand the broader Marvel universe, right? And in that same way, I think I'm going to pull this back even a little bit further. I think there's a particular age where kids are obsessed with finding out the limits and the rules and codifying their world. Okay, so it's like at that age, you're either going to obsess over sports teams and all the different pieces and the stats, or you're going to obsess. You're not going to obsess over school, God forbid.
Yeah,
so you've got to obsess over some fictional or some sort of other element, right? So you're gonna know all the names of every Pokemon, or you're gonna know just that magic age where you need to understand and break it all down. Right. And for a lot of us, it was either, the Handbook of the Marvel Universe, or it was video games, or it was tabletop games like D&D, or in some cases, combinations of them. Right. That your brain just sponges it up and needs to know more and just can't get enough, of that sort of stuff. And the world building aspect of D&D and the fact that there is this intricate, look at all these places and look at all this stuff and look at all these things. And they're imagination generators. That get you thinking about big, cool things. You know what I mean?
What now? Let's address the elephant in the room here, which is, what'd you think of that Dungeons and Dragons cartoon from the 80s?
So, it was interesting because D&D in the 80s was, this weird mixture of satanic panic. Where the parent groups were freaking out because it was going to, get your kid into the dark arts or something, mixed with really hokey merchandising and the corny cartoon. I didn't like the cartoon in the sense of the stories were very silly and dorky and whatever, but I liked that I knew what Dungeons and Dragons was, and I wanted it to be more than what it was. I wanted it to be cooler and darker, and it was when we played it, or at least in my head it was, and the novels and all those things. I think that you've also got to keep in mind, we are in this golden age of nerdity where everyone knows all these superheroes and all these things, but back then there was this desperation just for acknowledgement that this stuff is a big deal. And I use it hanging air quotes here, right? The Batman movie coming out was so transformative for a lot of us at that age, because it was everyone knew Batman. Everyone was excited about Batman again for the first time since the 60s, and so D&D being, quote, in the mainstream, and not just for, religious groups flipping out that it was going to take you to Satan's bosom or whatever. I feel, that was a good thing. The fact that I could buy Dungeons and Dragons video games for my Commodore 64, the fact that, there were action figures and all that stuff. That was the cool part of it for me. That was the interesting part of it for me.
And you always kind of wanted to tune into that cartoon, hoping this was going to be the episode where the kids are just brutally murdered.
It never happened. It would be interesting because it's maybe this is different for Americans, but so I'm a Canadian, and there's this running gag that anytime Canada gets mentioned in any pop culture whatsoever, we just get excited because it's people remember we exist. You know what I mean? So it's they say literally something, even if it's demeaning. It's in South Park, they're making fun of Canadians and saying that we all have pop top heads, and we're Canada, yay! They set a represent. So it's watching the D&D cartoon. It was oh, they set a spell I recognize, yay! They set magic missile or something that's good enough. You know what I mean?
Because a few years after that, you had the Conan the Adventurer cartoon.
Yeah, I was already too old kind of for it by that point. I read the Conan novels, obviously the Robert E. Howard stuff and some of the satellite stuff that they did later. And I was voraciously reading the comics, and those were cool. Savage Sword was that forbidden fruit where they got to be extra violent, and every so often there would be a booby, and you'd be oh my God, I'm in the promised land. You just,
it great. What about the did you like the movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
I did. So it's interesting now because obviously, so I write Conan the Barbarian now. Yeah. And so I'm a lot more of I loathe to use the term scholar, but I'm a lot more of a knowledgeable about the canon and stuff like that. And the movie Conan is not the literary Conan or the comic book Conan. Not at all. They take a lot of different bits and pieces from other Robert E. Howard stories mixed with sort of John Milius's raw, let's kick some ass stuff. Yeah. And it is a very compelling, very entertaining movie. They do the smart thing where they're, those iconic lines where the riddle of steel and, what is best in life. Those are not from any Robert E. Howard book or comic or that Roy Thomas did or anything, but they've become branded into pop culture so strong, and Arnold's visage has been branded into pop culture so strong in good and bad ways, in the sense that the Arnold isms, people assume that Conan is more, how's it, like, that he's not, smart, or he doesn't have the same amount of guile, that he's just this lumbering monster kicking ass.
Yeah.
And it's like in the books, Conan becomes a king by his own hands because he's incredibly intelligent. He is instinctive, and he is, but he becomes quite book learned in the books, and he learns multiple languages, and he understands other cultures, and he's able to motivate people and become a leader. You know what I mean? Like that's the canon in the books. And they don't touch upon any of those things because in the Milius movie, they give him this slave background, which he doesn't have in the books, which is actually kind of pieces taken from King Kull. And they've sort of messed them all together and mushed them with a bunch of other stuff. And so to answer your question, it's a really compelling movie. I really enjoyed it as a kid because it felt like the most D&D movie I'd ever seen. Yeah. Particularly because there are a bunch of like mercs, thieves breaking into the temple, stealing the gem, kill the big snake, kick ass. That's a D&D campaign to me. You know what I mean?
Heist.
Yeah, it's a heist. And so to me, it was almost like it was a really cool D&D movie more than it was a Conan movie.
Yeah.
And I love that film, and I think it's really fun. It's got just the most bombastic soundtrack, and it's all ass kick, and it's a pop culture kind of footprint can't be denied, right? So I'm thrilled that it exists. And yet once you start writing Conan, the first thing anyone will say, you're like, hey, what are you working on right now? Oh, Conan the Barbarian. And they're like, yeah, the Riddle of Steel. And you're like, yes, but, that is part, but I don't, like, so are you going to answer the Riddle of Steel? Like, no, that's not actually a thing. Like, it's cool. I like it, but
I miss the movies. I miss the fantasy movies back then because they did seem to, none of them took themselves that seriously. It was,
well, they didn't have the budget to take themselves.
Yeah. There's something charming about that. Now it's such big business. I loved going to the video store, and they would get like, Boris Vallejo and these other fantasy artists to do these just amazing airbrushed video covers. And you're like, holy crap. And then you watch the film and you're like, ooh, paper mache monsters. All right, let's do it. It was the current cover gimmick scheme, but
it was in video, right? It was like on video games as well. And you'd see those Atari covers, and they'd have beautifully painted images, and then you play the thing, and it's just big fat squares smashing into each other or whatever.
And like the cover, like that first Mega Man game on Nintendo, where it's like it's a guy in like a suit, and it has nothing to do with with
it's amazing.
Mega Man. But since we're on this topic anyway, and like you said, you're a scholar of Conan, but enough that you could probably answer this question. There might be people who are listening to this who are like, I know Conan, I've seen the movie, I've done all that. What's a good place to jump in other than what you're working on?
Right.
What in like the past? I mean, because now Marvel is putting out omnibuses and epic collections of all the old stuff. So where's a good place for someone to jump in and get into?
And I mean this in all honesty, Conan is way easier to get into than any superhero book. Way easier, because there's basically 3 different eras that tend to encompass the character. You've got when he's young and kind of impetuous, troublemaking. This is like a Frost Giant's Daughter and God in the Bowl and those kinds of Robert E. Howard stories. You've got him kind of in his prime, going on these big epic adventures and Queen of the Black Coast and all this sort of stuff. And then you've got him as the king, like Phoenix on the Sword and all these other, epic tales of King Conan. Those are really those 3 eras. And most writers will fall into one of those 3 kind of laneways. They'll tell cool stories. They'll put them in different places in the Hyborian Age. Bring on the threat, whether that's a man or a monster, a god or a spirit, and let's kick some ass. Like, let's make it epic and put the thumb screws on Conan and make things hard for him. Like, it's really classic, pulpy, awesome adventure. And most of the stories, carry forward in a broader sense, but there's not like a hardcore in-depth continuity, right? So Roy Thomas will he has written more stories than anyone else, more than Robert and more than, any other writer. So he'll reference some of his older stuff, but in that classic comic book way, as soon as he references something, he always gets you up to speed on, what the motivation was, or, oh, these two characters, they've been in capers before and now they hate each other. Ta-da! Like, that's all you need to know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's something I try and aspire to in my own comic work, where it's like, have a thread of continuity, but never leave people behind if they haven't read it,
Yeah.
And so, as dorky as it sounds, you can pick up the first Conan the Barbarian omnibus and enjoy it thoroughly, or you can grab whatever, 3, 4, 5. You're not really going to get pushed out. Savage Sword is the same thing. I think Savage Sword's a more beautiful book because the black and white artwork seems to bring out the best in so many artists. John Buscema's the classic, but like Ernie Chan and like dozens of other artists, for some reason, when you unhinged and just said, do whatever you want in this black and white space, they just seem to go buck. And I don't know if they were given more time or more money, but they put the most intricate, detailed line work into those stories. And because it was going to be a magazine on the newsstands and they could get a bit gorier and a bit more intense, they did so. And so it feels like it kind of took the chains off and they really went to town. Yeah. So for me, it's like grab first Savage Sword omnibus and you can't do any wrong. What's nice about it is Roy and the crew they'll adapt some of the classic stories, but then they'll insert their own stories as well. And you can't tell most of the time. Like, most of the time they're just great classic, pulp sword and sorcery stuff through and through. Yeah,
it's I agree with you. I a lot of people would come into Conan, and one of the shops that I owned, I think, had the audience. It fit the demographic very well. That really liked Conan. That was one of the more popular titles there, and there was never any conversation about when is a good jumping on point.
Right.
I must have gone years. I never heard that.
No, you look at the cover. Does that look cool? Grab that one. You know what I mean? Yeah. Most of the stories are 1, 2, 2-parters are rare, 3-parters are rarer in those old books. Like, a lot of them are done in ones. You know what I mean? Yeah. Or they'll have a satisfying chunk of adventure that carries forward to the next one. But again, you could have picked up part 2 and just be like, oh man, I got to go. Yeah, everything's, And that's very much in a classic storytelling model that I feel like we've lost when too many writers write for the trade. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yep. It's funny because we talked about it a little bit last time, and then I went back and I read a bunch of your work in just different pieces. Nice. And what's interesting is you there's not this sense of, I don't know the best way to put it, like falsely is saying, hey, now's when you come into this book. There's not this like it feels like you could just read the title. I think either writers overthink it or they get kind of obsessed with this idea of like, I've got to make this a good jumping on point.
Right.
It feels very jagged as a result.
It can. For me, it's because I'm taking a lot of my influences from the 80s books that I really enjoyed. Yeah. And I know it's a running gag and some of the old timers will roll their eyes, the Jim Shooter, any issue is someone's first. Mm-hmm. And when you read old Claremont X-Men, back to back to back, it can make your eyes roll because every issue they're telling you about the ruby quartz visor and, adamantium bones and all that stuff. But on the other hand, man, oh man, is it really easy to know, what the score is and what everyone needs to do and how they care about each other or don't. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so for me, I kind of go in with a bit of that model. And for better or for worse, a lot of times I haven't been given a number 1 at Marvel. So if I come in on Champions number 19, it ain't number 1. You know what I mean? So part of my job is to move the ball forward and get you up to speed on what's different, but also carry the baton, you know what I mean? And move to the next goal with it, right?
It doesn't, it consistently, and it really did feel like the 80s, your stuff doesn't grind to a halt in order to almost like stop the bus. Okay, everybody get on, and then we'll get going again. Yeah. But you lose all the momentum. And that's what Claremont, you do. When you read this stuff, you're like, how many times I'm going to have to hear about the Ruby?
Sure.
But it doesn't blow up the story. Like you don't. you don't stop. It's like a one dialogue and then you're moving on.
And right. And if you do it well, you can be relatively elegant about it, or you can, what you want to avoid is what we jokingly call, as you know, when two characters know each other, they go, as you know, Scott, blah, blah, blah. And they would never do that in the X-Men comics. I'm just saying whatever Scott Summers. But in really hokey comics where characters are telling each other things they already know, you've got to frame it in such a way, or bring a touchstone character in, or have something, some observer or some way of informing the reader in an interesting fashion. So a perfect example I think of is one of my absolute favorite issues of Uncanny X-Men. It's like in the midst of Fall of the Mutants, Alan Davis drew it, and it's that Wolverine and Sabretooth battle that happens in the mansion. And Psylocke is joined the mansion, and the first chunk of the book is her psychic presence moving through the house. And so she is talking about everyone's stuff, their power,
the state of what happened with Mutant Massacre, and
their motivations, what their fears are, because she can pick up on their emotions and their mental state. And it's like checking in with everybody, and it's all stuff that you as a regular reader know, but damn if it's not compelling. What I mean? Damn if it's not elegantly done, because she's also framing it in her opinions of these characters. So you're getting a new piece of information, and you're catching everyone up to speed, right? And that's the trick. You've got to find a way to do the thing. So like my second issue of Uncanny Avengers, when I took over from Jerry, Scarlet Witch joined the team. Love Wanda. She's one of my favorite characters. I would love to do more stuff with her. And because she was entering the dynamic of the team, that put everyone on edge, and they were all reacting to her. And she's getting up to speed on how the team has been functioning up to that point. And so it's not the same, obviously, but it serves the same purpose. Everyone has to let Wanda know, or she has to observe something, and therefore now you know that, for example, the Human Torch and Rogue had a relationship, and now they're on the rocks and it's not good. Or Quicksilver, and his dynamic, and of course that's her brother, and how are they getting along or not getting along, and Dr. Voodoo and all these other characters. Janet Van Dyne's there, but Rogue is the leader of the team. But Janet's more experienced and is a legacy chairwoman of the Avengers, and is trying not to be the leader, but can't help but fall back into those old patterns. You know what I mean? And it's like, those are the fun kind of sparks and dynamics that I loved in the books, and trying to frame those and build those. I love team books. Like I love the dynamics of them. I love that every time you think that there's nothing new to do, you just have to change up the chemistry of those characters. And now you've got plot, you've got potential, and I feel like it's where I wouldn't have imagined this when I started in the business, but it's where I feel most comfortable is creating sparks off those teams. You know what I mean? And it's weird, because if you would have asked me, and if you ask me now, my favorite books at Marvel and the books I would love to do, they're almost all solo titles, because that's what I grew up on, and those are some of my favorite characters. And I'm sure I would do a good job, but for whatever reason, my editors have figured out, like, you know what, Jim's good at team dynamics, so kind of plug him in there. And it's like, I was never grudging about it. It was just like, I kind of have learned to love it because of all the potential.
I mean, your background in playing Dungeons and Dragons and dealing with a party dynamic and all the rest, I think there's a connection there.
Perhaps. There is. So rolling it back to D&D is kind of really interesting, actually. Dungeons and Dragons, is about a team dynamic, exactly that. And after my brother went off to university, I became the dungeon master. I became the game master on all the games that my friends and I were playing. And the enjoyment I had setting up scenarios and then watching that interplay, and the improv that happens as people are making decisions. The best role-playing games are the ones where the players do something insanely unexpected, but in the moment they do it, it feels like the right thing that should have always happened. And a good story is like that too, that you want to take the readers in an unexpected direction, and the minute they read it, they go, what? And then they go, yeah, but it couldn't have gone any other way. But you've surprised them. You know what I mean? And so role-playing games taught me so much about entertainment. They taught me a lot about improv. They taught me about taking the ingredients that you've got and making the most of them in that moment. right? And that's what working in a sandbox like the Marvel Universe is like, if we're going to be honest, you know? And just even making the most of any ingredients. Like my first job at Marvel was not an in continuity book. I had, tried to get in at Marvel several times. I actually did work at DC before I did at Marvel as a writer. So I did, the first opportunity I got at DC was, I had been doing Skull Kickers for a little while. And then I did that Pathfinder book at Dynamite. And that got me, like, I wasn't like huge prestige or anything, but they were, monthly books and they were coming out on time and they looked good and everything else.
It's like building up a portfolio of work. Right. It's this amazing concept.
It was bonkers. Yeah. And the New 52 had launched. And one of the things internally they wanted to do was get back to the books had to be monthly. Yeah. So you could not be late because Dan DiDio had promised retailers the books would not be late for at least a year or some. I don't think he framed it like that. Like, don't quote me.
That was kind of the promise. Now, nobody believed it or frankly, I think would have held him to it, but that's a different story.
But internally, they were building the classic structure. So one of the things they used to do were inventory issues. And it's funny, I have to explain this, but they were a thing where you would have these done in one issues that were done by different creative teams. And if the book was not going to come out on time, the regular monthly issue, you could slot in one of these inventories. And it's the reason why when you look at some of the old trades and you see what's reprinted, there'll suddenly be a gap in the numbers. And you're like, why is that issue not in there? Because it was an inventory. It didn't follow the regular continuity and stuff like that. Yeah. And not that inventory issues are bad. Some of them can be amazing.
No, I think it's helpful, actually. Yeah. I think it can be helpful. But
it's also a really good testing ground for editors and publishers to see people's chops, to see what they're capable of. And so I was asked to do, I'm trying to think of the editor's name. I want to say Pat McCallum. He asked me to do, because I had been doing Skull Kickers, and Skull Kickers was about these morally reprehensible, bastards in this fantasy world causing trouble. He asked me to do an inventory pitch for Suicide Squad, a bunch of morally, reprehensible whatevers. And so I pitched a bunch of concepts at him, and he liked a couple of them, and then got me to write a script for him. I tried to be really ambitious. This is my first big 2 work, and I poured my heart into that thing. And the structure I came up with was it's Deadshot, and there's 20 minutes until something explosive is going to happen, and it's a minute per page. And so it's going to be this countdown to disaster, and it's going to be all about the momentum and all this kind of stuff with a counter in the corner. And I wrote the thing, and he really liked it, and I got paid for it. And I thought, woohoo, I'm in the driver's seat. It's going to happen now. And for a little while there at DC, I was being asked to pitch on a bunch of different stuff. But at the time, they were doing what's called a bake-off. So a bake-off is when you get multiple writers pitching on books. Sometimes they tell you, sometimes they don't. And, I was sort of middle of the pack, so I would throw an idea in there, and they were like, that's cool. Unfortunately, we went another direction. That happened 2 or 3 times. And it's not all bad. Like, of course, it's, you feel crappy because you, in your head, you want to be the writer of fill in the blank, but it's a good way to test yourself and to figure things out. And pitching is valuable. Learning to pitch well is valuable.
And it could be worse. They could do it in public and have people vote on it on Instagram. I'm just kidding.
But I feel bad, honestly, for all the creative teams, like in the public square. That's tough. That's a really tough place to be. I don't envy anyone that going through the grinder on that, because it's already stressful enough to put together those pitches. And you can't do a good book if you don't put some of yourself into it. There's a saying where you're like, well, you can't take it personally. And you're like, yeah, I know. And yet
that concept doesn't work. You can't divorce yourself completely emotionally.
If I didn't care about it, why am I here? You know what I mean? Like, why am I pitching on these characters or doing, and even for me, when I'm pitching, if I'm asked to pitch on a particular concept, my first thing I need to do is go research and learn to love it, like find an angle that's going to work for me. Otherwise you're just going to get pablum. You know what I mean? And so I pitched some stuff at DC. Eventually, Bobby Chase came back to me. This is a good year into the new 52. And they asked me to pitch on Birds of Prey, which had been running right from the start. Mm-hmm. And I pitched on Birds of Prey. I had the book for a few months and was writing on it, and it got announced. And then plans changed. And there was a lot of tumultuous stuff going on at DC at that point. And this was about as frenzied as it got in the midst of the new 52. And a lot of people got kind of ground into powder against the wheels of change around there. And I got just absolutely crushed through and spit out the other side. And so all of a sudden I wasn't doing DC stuff anymore. And it was honestly like heartrending, because I thought I was on the upswing of my writing career, and now I'm not. And there's a certain number of people in the industry, and I don't think it's all intentional. When you're doing big two work, there's a prestige that comes with it, and there's a, hey, be my friend-ism that comes with it. Mm-hmm. And when you're not, they're not.
Yep.
You know, and all of a sudden, as dorky as it sounds, you find out who your real friends are. Yep. And I think that's true of any industry. I think that's true of music and acting and whatever, you know.
Definitely true. Yeah.
Creative industries, right? When you're hot, people want to know you. And when you're not, they're like, oh yeah, whatever. And that's fine, right? Like, it was just the sort of nature of the thing I learned very, very early on. I did do a couple more things at DC. Hank Canals was in the digital department, and he really liked those articles that I was starting to write about how to break into comics, how to write your own stuff, how to pitch, some of the financial stuff that I was starting to post by that point. And he reached out and asked me to do a Legends of the Dark Knight story. Mm-hmm. And so I got to write Batman. That was pretty great. Yeah. Neil Googe drew it. I'm super proud of that story. I absolutely love it. I'm very, very proud of it. The day it came out, it was on DC Digital. Paul Dini contacted me because it was a Harley Quinn story, and he said, you know, you did right by Harley. And I was just like, holy,
that's a nice, that's
nice. Could I have gotten a higher compliment, right? Like, it was the best feeling. And particularly when I felt pretty battered off of the other DC stuff, I was like, oh, this is okay. I'm not dead yet. You know what I mean? But I definitely felt like I was in a weird state where I didn't know my future. And I was kind of wondering if I was kind of on my way out of comics. I had been talking to IDW about another project. And then when the DC opportunity came up, I basically said, I need to focus on this completely. So that IDW thing passed me by. And then I kind of came back, hat in my hand, like, got anything else? And they actually said, we're doing a bake-off for Samurai Jack. We've got the Lights of Samurai Jack, hasn't been announced yet. We're looking for pitches, but you're gonna have to hand it in fast. We're literally deciding next week. And so I had like 3 days to pull together a pitch for Samurai Jack. I watched some of my favorite episodes. I dug in over that weekend, wrote the pitch in like less than 48 hours, sent it on, and mine was the one that Cartoon Network picked. Nice. So all of a sudden, and Andy Suriano, who was one of the designers on the show, was drawing it, and it was a relatively, like, it wasn't like a huge announcement, but it was like oh man, this kind of came out of nowhere, and there's so much love for that show from that demographic, and people were kind of freaking out, and it kind of brought me back to life in terms of my career. People were like, oh, Jim's doing some stuff, and literally the day it was announced, like a bunch of DC and Marvel editors got in touch with me, and they were like, hey man, how's it going? And I was just like, what? Okay, I guess I'm not dead yet, like I'm still on the table.
And then your friends all come back to borrow your whiskey and things.
Not exactly. I mean, like I said, I've got lots of friends in comics. Don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm weeping in the corner or some stuff, but it was just like, there's certain, I don't know how else to put it.
It's every industry. It's definitely it's amazing how many people are around to help you celebrate when things are going well.
Absolutely. Success has many fathers and failure is an orphan, right?
Yes, exactly. I am curious, since you mentioned the Suicide Squad inventory story.
Yes.
How did you feel about it being released like all those years later?
So I'll kind of get you caught up on that, because that's a weird one. Mm-hmm. So the Suicide Squad story, sat in a drawer, and what would happen was every few years there would be a new Suicide Squad editor, and they would get all the material. And the real keeners would read all the stuff that they had in the drawer, the digital drawer, whatever you want, equivalent. And I kept getting contacted, and they were like, this script is great. And I was like, thanks, we should do it. I'm like, cool, you should do it. And then it would be like flatline, like I wouldn't hear anything from them. Or they would contact me and they go, did we pay for this? And I'm like, yes, it's all paid for. It's yours. You should do something with it. And they were like, cool. And then nothing would happen. And then Brian Cunningham took over the series when they were going to do the launch with Jim Lee when the movie was coming out.
Right.
And he was I'm pretty sure the book had a more than monthly ship schedule. It was like aggressive because Suicide Squad, it was sort of like the big hope for DC at that point.
You're right. It wasn't a double ship, but it was close to it. It was doing that. Yeah.
Kind of and Brian was like terrified that the book was going to ship late because, you know, you've got all this high end prestige and whatever. And he said, I love this inventory issue. I would love to, put it on the schedule. And I was like, dude, Suicide Squad's hot as hell. I would be overjoyed. You know what I mean? That would be amazing. And so we talked back and forth about the artist with the most kinetic look. And we both agreed Tradd Moore's like the kinetic guy. Like he's just got this incredible momentum to his artwork, and everything feels like it's moving even when they're standing still. And I was like, that would be ideal. Andy Curry, who was the assistant editor on Suicide Squad, contacted me, and we jammed back and forth. And he's like, you're a better writer now than you were then. Do you want to change it up? And I was like, actually, yeah, it would be nice if Deadshot had someone to jam with. And so I added Harley to the story, and all the interplay just got that much better. So instead of one silent guy kicking ass, it was like her commenting, and the way that they go about a mission and the contrast made it really fun. And the script was even better for it. They hired Tradd to do the issue. He drew the living hell out of it. It was absolutely stunning. We were all just kind of blown back by it. And then it got buried and they didn't use it. And I was just absolutely crushed that the book got.
I don't mean to laugh. It's just.
Oh man, I know it was hilarious. Like, but it got thrown in a drawer again. This time, lettered and colored and finished. And I was just like, "Holy crap!" And I asked around about it and didn't get clear answers. And then eventually heard through the grapevine they were like, "Yeah, it's just not." Tradd's artwork is so out there, and now in the story the characters aren't quite at the same point they were then, and it doesn't fit anymore. And I was like, okay, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, nobody likes Tradd Moore. Whenever he does everything, they're like, I hate this guy. His stuff is so boring.
Well, anyways, and and he's this prestige artist, and I'm thinking, man, just having a Tradd Moore book is such a joy for me. I bought a page from the issue, and I kept it hidden because no one even knew the issue existed.
And you put it in the drawer.
I've got it in my office, right? So, but what happened was the big upheavals and changes at DC came about, and Mary Javins took over, and Batman Black and White came out, and that first issue's got Tradd Moore in it. And I started laughing because I was like, well, clearly they're okay with Tradd Moore. They put him in their first issue. Like they made a big, to-do of it. So I sent a blind email to editorial and just said, you guys know you have a Tradd Moore issue sitting in a drawer, right? Like done, ready to go. You can just print money anytime you want it. And I don't know if it was because of that, but I guess they did some more digging and they found 5-6 issues complete in drawers that they could make that miniseries out of called, what was it? Let Them Live. That they released. And mine was the first issue. So yes, many years later, my Suicide Squad story came out.
It was a really good issue though. And people always say like,
I'm super proud of it actually.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it.
It's fun. I feel like when you talk to, you're interviewing people, you're always very complimentary. I mean, one, I'm not a dick, but also it was a good issue. Like you pick it up, it was a good issue. I'm not being backseat driver here, but like they could have put this out at any time.
It was a classic inventory issue. Like, it was meant to fit in between anywhere. Yeah.
You could have thrown that into an annual and shipped it that way. Yeah. If anything, I'm very torn because I like the idea of pulling these comics out of the drawer and letting people see them. I'm really fond of that idea. I hated the way they marketed it. And I'm not, by the way,
I don't have any control of any of that stuff.
Let them live. Like, it lowered the expectation of what was really good books. I would hear from people like, well, this is remnant work. It's like, no, it's Zub and Tread Moore on this book.
Right.
Like, this isn't
what made me laugh was a bunch of people thought it was brand new. So they were like, oh, does this mean you're taking over Suicide Squad? And I was like, no, dude, I wrote that years ago. And they go, no, I know. Yeah. And the Sentry was a character created by Stan Lee. Sure, Jim. No, I was no, really? Like, I really did do this way back in the day. Like, that is a very old script, and my first Big Two work, hilariously. And so I was doing stuff at IDW. I ended up doing the Dungeons and Dragons comic series that I've been doing ever since. And the funniest part about that was the way D&D came about was hilarious. Ted Adams, who's one of the owners of IDW at the time, he sees me at a convention and he comes over to the table and we're having a great conversation. And he says, Samurai Jack is one of my favorite comics we publish. I want you to do more work for us. And I'm like, twist my rubber arm. Yeah, that would be great. And he goes, of the books we have, what interests you? And I was like, honestly, Turtles or Dungeons and Dragons. And he goes, well, Kevin Eastman's coming back, and no offense, that guy's got priority. But D&D, really? I was like, D&D, really? Like, I'm obsessed with D&D. I absolutely love this stuff. And you got to keep in mind at the time, this is before 5th edition D&D launches. 4th edition is really contentious amongst the fan base of Dungeons and Dragons. People love it or hate it. But the sales by the end were very low on the game. So it was not considered a dead license, but it was certainly, like, IDW had, I think it's called the master license for, like, Hasbro. So they had Transformers and G.I. Joe and My Little Pony, and D&D is thrown in, along with Gem and the Holograms and all other stuff. And so they had the rights to do it, but they weren't currently doing any D&D books. And they were in no rush to do them either. So I said, look, there's a new edition that's in development, because I'm a big tabletop nerd. I'm keeping up on this stuff. If you're going to launch the book, now's the time to do it again. Like, you got to try. And Ted was like, look, man, like I said, I really want you to do more stuff for us. I'll set up a conference call. Let's talk to them. And so I got on the line with Wizards of the Coast, and we just chatted, and they very quickly realized I was as big a gaming nerd as I was a comic nerd. And they were very excited about having me on board. And they talked about the fact that in the future, they hoped there would be more Baldur's Gate video games, because those were really, really big sellers, but that they were purposefully kind of leaving the city of Baldur's Gate alone so it could be its own thing in their role-playing books. And they said, you can use that as your playground as long as you don't change anything major. And I was like, yeah, man, cool capers and heists, and get to use some fan favorite characters from games that have sold millions of copies while the new edition of D&D is coming out. Yes, sir. Like, I'm down. And we launched that book within a month of D&D 5th edition launching. And now, that was 2014. Like, here we are 7 years later. Dungeons and Dragons has never been bigger. It's bigger than it was in the 80s. It's bigger when it was at any point in history. Their latest demographic things that they publicly show say that they have 50 million active players, active, like, in their community, retweeting, watching streams, heavily into the merchandise, heavily buying the books. Like, every single source book is selling millions of copies. It is wild, absolutely wild time for Dungeons and Dragons. And tabletop role-playing game has, all ships have risen off of its success.
Yeah.
And the hilarious part is now so many people in the industry are like, how do I get on this rocket ride? Because I lucked out. My editor at IDW, John Barber, is an amazing guy. He was never a tabletop guy. So he and I know each other quite well, and he was doing a great job managing the book. But all he was managing was like, is the stuff coming in on time? Is it approved from the licensor? I started to interface directly with Wizards of the Coast because we were talking the same language. We're talking about real deep nerd stuff about the books. And so eventually, it's not that I was cutting John out. We were just jumping on conference calls directly with Wizards every time I wanted to do something cool or different. And the Wizards people kind of built up an amount of trust and respect with me. And then they started hiring me directly to do other consulting.
Yeah.
So I started doing other writing and development for them. I've done like, media proposals and all kinds of stuff that is not front facing.
WotC has always kind of had that culture though. If they find somebody that they can talk directly to, they just prefer it. And
they're great. Like, and I love them over there. They're like family now. I ended up going to the office for a full week and basically helping them develop one of their source books. They do this really smart thing called a story push. Mm-hmm. Every major project they do, they don't want to be so insular that they're always getting the same opinions. So they'll hire an outside author, usually a fantasy author or whatever, just to come in and jam with them to mix up things at the table. And so it was like my turn. Like they called me up and asked if I wanted to come in, and they paid me this consulting fee and flew me out. And it was amazing because every day we'd be in the office brainstorming cool stuff. And then every night we'd grab dinner and then stay up late chatting all of our memories, playing the games and just kind of digging below the surface and getting to know each other in ways that you can't, it's hard to describe. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah. And I've got friends who work there, and the downside, at least as it was, is you're going to glorious Renton,
right? Oh yeah, it is out of the city. Yeah, exactly. I was staying at a hotel that was like 2 blocks away from the office. And it's like you are not getting downtown. You are off in this little wherever the hell you are.
You have an IKEA nearby, I think.
Yes. Yeah. But those conversations have turned into so many other projects. Like one of the things we talked about was me starting to play D&D when I was 8 years old, and why the game grabbed my imagination. And so like 8 or 9 months later, Adam Lee, who's one of the heads of story over there, he contacts me. He says, we're working with another publisher at Random House to produce this project for kids, like these. We don't know what it's going to be yet. Some sort of a way to bring kids into D&D. And all I could remember was that conversation where you said why at 8 years old it was the perfect, thing. Can I get you on the phone with Random House to talk about why 8-year-olds love D&D? And I was like, sure. And by the end of the conversation, it was, I don't want you to pay me a one-time consulting fee to tell you why D&D is cool. I want to run this project. Like, this is like, feels like coming full circle. And so my friend Andrew and my wife Stacy and we are now the writers of these things called the Dungeons and Dragons Young Adventurers Guides. And it's currently a 6-book series at Random House. And they've been amazing, promoting these books, putting them in libraries, getting them out at book fairs. And because of the D&D surge, they're doing extremely well. And I get photos from little kids clutching these books.
That's the best.
And they're drawing pictures of their characters and they're telling me their stories and all this stuff. The books have been published in like 5 languages. Like it's honestly, I don't know. It could end up being the most influential thing I work on. You know what I mean? Like years from now, adults coming over and saying the reason why I play D&D is because of these little, pocket books that we put together.
Yeah.
I've done other videos and talked to plenty of people. The value of the kids market continues to
massive.
People underrepresent it, but it's massive. But I'd say a different way. Some creators, I think, struggle with it at being kind of the junior stuff or the interest.
Yeah,
and they're missing the value.
Right. The first book I did at Marvel was for that Disney Kingdoms line.
Yeah, the Figment.
I did the Figment book. And the reason why that book happened was because editor Bill Roseman, who was in charge of special projects, he didn't know anything about Figment. He knew it was about a dragon. And he's like, I should get a fantasy guy. And he goes, oh, Jim's a fantasy guy. And so he contacted me because he thought it was going to be a bit like Dungeons and Dragons or something.
Oh, he had never gone on the ride then. Yes.
Well, the good news is I'm an animation buff and nerd. And at the college, I teach animation history. So I knew all the Journey into Imagination stuff. I knew all the Disney stuff. And so I was the right fit, but not for the reasons he thought.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
That's funny.
And the Disney thing ended up working out well. And to this day, Disney fans bring those books over to me and they get super excited. And I'm really proud of what we were able to build with those books. And that Bill was an amazing contact at Marvel. Have you ever met Bill Roseman?
I have, yeah. Joe?
I don't think I have, but yeah.
Man, Bill is the nicest. Like, there are some people who are surface level nice, and you're like, you're putting on an act. And then there are people that are so richly nice, you're like, you can't be faking it. Like, you really, like, sunshine is glowing out of your pores. Like, my God. Bill is such a nice guy and so supportive and so kind. It's like Scott McCloud we talked about last interview. And Bill and I got along really, really well. He was the first editor. I was in New York for other things. And I said, Bill, I'm in New York. I would love to see the Marvel offices. I've never been there. And he said, you've never been to Marvel? Come on up here, buddy. And he was just like, it was not actually easy to get in the doors at Marvel at that point because the movie stuff had been roaring. They were real closed door to outsiders, even if you were doing freelance work for them, if you weren't there for a very specific reason. But Bill just like brought me up because he knows I'm a big fanboy and toured me around the office and shaking hands and, being kind to everyone. And then he sits down in his office and he goes, I got a question for you. And I'm like, what? He goes, what's the first Marvel comic you remember buying, with your own money? And I was like, whoa. And I go, Amazing Spider-Man. It's either 231 or 232. And he goes, Dr. Hyde's on the cover? I said, no, the Cobra. That's the issue after. And he goes, I know it. And that's Bill. Like he knows.
He's one of those people. There's a lot of people who, and Joe and I've talked to a few, Glenn Greenberg's another. There's some people who just love the company. They're wonderful people. They get no notice. I mean, their name's not well known, and it's always a shame because there's some really good people in these companies.
Well, what's funny now? So Bill and I got along amazingly well. And so he started sending me tons of work. So I would do the candy comics, as we lovingly called them, the little insert comics that would go in the cereal boxes or the digital giveaway stuff. And a lot, you were saying about art, people turning up their nose at it or being, oh, that stuff's crap. You're like, you know what? First of all, it pays the same page rate as anything else at Marvel. And second of all, you learn a lot because you got to complete the stuff under a tight deadline. You got to deliver the goods and you got to have the characters in their voices and find ways to make it entertaining, even if you're doing a candy bar comic or whatever. And Bill really appreciated that I could hit the mark and knew what I was doing with this stuff because Udon had done those kinds of projects for years. And I was like, yeah, I know how it's going. Don't put guns and don't have, violence. And like, this is not the place for that. Right. Then he ended up asking me to do, this is the weirdest product. In the UK, they have something called, in Europe, they have something called Spider-Man Magazine. I think they probably still have it.
Yep.
And every month, it's got mazes and games for kids and a 12-page original Spider-Man story. And someone's got to write that.
Yep.
And at the time, it was tying into the cartoon called Web Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
And so if a character had shown up on Web Warriors, I could use them. Well, Web Warriors had Thor and Hulk and Captain America. Blade showed up in an episode. Yeah. So I just started doing team-ups almost every single issue. And then I got to show that I could write all those characters.
Yeah, that was smart.
So it was like a proving ground for me. And then Bill and I were developing something together, an original new Marvel concept. He actually had quite a boost in his profile because he was the editor on Guardians of the Galaxy when I forget the names of the guys who did it. The version that they used for the movies, basically.
Dan Abbott and Neil
Yeah. He was the editor on that book. So Guardians of the Galaxy blows up and everyone's like, Bill's great. And Bill was great, but it was like a reminder to everyone how good of an editor he was. And so he had a bit of cachet and he's like, I want to do another team of like misfits in a different part of the Marvel universe. I would love for you to write this. And I was like, oh my God, that would be so great. So we were in the midst of developing it. And it was supposed to launch before Secret Wars, then during Secret Wars, then after Secret Wars. And it just kept getting moved around the schedule. And then he got a promotion and he moved to the West Coast and took over Marvel Games, where he is now the head of Marvel Games.
Oh.
But that meant that our project died on the vine.
Mm-hmm.
But Bill did the favor of a lifetime to me. On the way out the door, he basically said to Tom Brevoort in the Avengers office, Jim's really great. He delivers the goods. You should give this guy a shot.
Yeah. Well, and that's certainly paid off. I mean,
right.
Like we talked about in the last, video we did, you did this Avengers event, got you a huge profile there, got to work with some big characters, big names. I mean, go through the entire Avengers line. You're doing Conan now. There was something Joe mentioned earlier that we really wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
I don't know, Joe, you had this idea.
You have an interesting background for someone in comics writing, in that you have co-written, and you touched on this the last time,
right.
with some high-profile people. A lot of people that do co-writing comics tend to have like a team, like they come in together, like Dan Abbott and Neil Lanning, like Zach Thompson and Lonnie Nadler.
Sure.
You don't really have that, but you've jumped in, and you've co-written with Mark Waid, Gail Simone, like all these people. How do you tackle that? How is it different? How do you get used to figuring out, like, okay, this is my strength, this is your strength, let's make it happen?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, every writing project and every editor is a different relationship, right? Yeah. And then with a co-writer, it's like that magnified. You need to figure out where you fit. I lucked out in the fact that the co-writing that I've done, the vast majority of it has been a real joy, where I'm able to find my place. So Gail, for example, and I did that Conan Red Sonja crossover miniseries, and it was a blast. She was writing, obviously, Red Sonja at the time. I'd always wanted to write Conan, and she knew that I knew the lore. And so she and I ended up teaming up, and she had the broad kind of story figured out, and I was all like detail oriented. And so I could hunker in and go, oh, you know what? We can bring in this little bit of lore. We can do this cool kind of thing, and break it down and make it all kind of function in a way that we could send the proposal to the licensor, and they were like, oh yeah, this makes sense, and it was just a really cool opportunity, and proved, that exactly what you kind of said, like finding your place and knowing, what you do well. I'm trying to think, the next co-writing thing I would have done might have been the Avengers Weekly project, where I ended up kind of, I'm not saying project managing, because obviously Tom was the editor on that book, but did a lot of pacing, did a lot of reference gathering, did a lot of, fitting pieces together and making sure that stuff functioned. What was unique about that weekly series was we had 3 artists who were quite compatible with each other, stylistically, all drawing simultaneously. So like Pepe Larraz is drawing issue 1, and like Paco Medina is drawing, I can't remember the exact numbers, like issue 5 or something. And Sean Isaacs is drawing another one. And it's like, you're making sure that if Quicksilver gets injured in this issue, it's the same injury that we're going to see in that next issue, even though that got drawn later. And so we had this reference pool where whoever drew a location first, even if it was in a later issue, that became the reference material that the artist used on the earlier issue. Like it was this friggin' Gordian knot of stuff that needed to get done to make it feel functional, so that we weren't going back and redrawing and changing a bunch of stuff later,
Do you think this could be a very oddball question, but because I enjoyed the story, it sold well. Was it worth it, in the sense of, I mean, for you, you mentioned last time you had a blast doing it. Was it like it was more, I mean, I don't think it's controversial. It would be more of a struggle to work in that kind of environment.
It was tough, but we were also able to, the advantage of the weekly release was you were freed from those things like I talked about before, where you have to get everyone up to speed. The conversation was constant, people felt, oh man, last week, crazy cliffhanger. This week, we're going to find out why. You know what I mean? The other funky thing was we were done the book by the time the first issue shipped. So you have this weird feeling of just hanging back and watching people react to it, which was really unique. And in a way you don't get, a lot of times by the time they're soliciting a 6-issue miniseries, you might be writing the last issue or you might not.
To the readers, I mean, I think the readers, the customers like it. Batman Eternal had a similar thing going on. And it was doing that. I always just wonder what the havoc behind the scenes, which sometimes can be an enjoyable havoc, if that makes any sense. But it's
the ideal with these kinds of serialized books are, I guess it's sort of like with the D&D game we were talking about before. You need to have enough structure that it makes sense, but you need to leave room for spontaneity. You need to leave room when you're writing to go, you know what, that's even better. We got to be able to pursue this cool creative burst in the moment. But with 3 writers, we had to have a pretty tight structure to make sure it was going to function. But every so often you'd get a cool synergy, or, Al or Mark would suddenly email and go, you know what we can do? We can do this even more, or we can foreshadow this even better. Because we were writing so much of it ahead of time, we could go back and make those little adjustments to make it feel so much tighter and more strategic about our planning,
And then you'd work with Dan Slott on Iron Man,
yes.
right? Wasn't
so
that?
Dan and I did, and that was, Tom has been my editor on the majority of Marvel books, and because of the goodwill that I built up on Avengers No Surrender and No Road Home, Tom called me up and basically said, hey, I know you get along really well with other writers, and you and Dan are friends in general. Dan's doing Fantastic Four and Iron Man, and it's a lot. I feel like you guys might gel really well. Let's do it. Are you interested? And I was like, yeah, that would be great. I'm really intrigued, with the book in general. Dan and I got on the horn and just chatted up a storm and got a sense of where he was seeing the book in 6, 8, 9 months, all the way through that 2020 storyline. Mm-hmm. And so I knew the big picture idea. I knew what he was going for. And I was like, yeah, I'm interested. Let's do it. And so it was like Dan was kind of doing it Marvel style. He was doing the Stan Lee thing where he would write the broad overview of the issue. Sometimes he would break down page by page, but other times he would just sort of say, this scene, this stuff is 3 pages or whatever. And then I would go in and I would panel it and I would dialogue it.
Nice. Okay.
And then I would also try and add little extra synergies, or I would call them up and go, you know what, this thing you did in this earlier issue, wouldn't it be cool if we brought that back? Or wouldn't it be, we can thematically kind of echo some of this stuff even more. And we jammed really well on that. At the time I was also doing Champions, and we were doing that relaunch that I talked about the last time we chatted. And I said, I've got Viv in my book, and he was going to have a thing with Vision in Iron Man 2020. And so I said, it would be really cool if we could tie the Champions into this and make them part of the event you're going to do with Ultron and with all this other stuff. He was super on board. And that's why at the end of Champions 26, the one before the relaunch, Sparky, the dog, ended up getting infected by Ultron, this little probe or whatever. And that was sort of a teaser of, in 6 months, we're going to do this thing. And it didn't end up happening. But the original plan was that I was going to be able to sort of synergize my books, because I had Riri in Champions, Ironheart, and I also had Viv, and I had, Sparky the dog, and we were going to be able to use them in a really fun kind of way with this Ultron storyline and play off the tech and all these sorts of things. So it just all kind of hung together really well in the plan. And then, the best laid plans, right? The Champions book doesn't end up lasting long enough to do the crossover, and midway through my run on Iron Man with Dan, I get the offer to do Conan.
Right.
And Conan is a bucket list book for me. I had never intended to be the writer of Conan the Barbarian. I had written Conan in No Road Home in the Avengers book, and I thought that's my last chance to write Conan. That's kind of a funny story about that. I assumed that both Al and Mark were going to really want to write Conan. And Mark's sort of ambivalent about the character. He doesn't dislike him, but he's not a huge fan. And Al Ewing was like, well, I know you're a bigger fan, so why don't you write the Conan stuff? And I was just like in my glory writing all these cool Conan things. And I came up with that issue where it's like Conan and Scarlet Witch across the Hyborian Age and the desert and all that stuff. It was like the witch and the barbarian, like it's all classic kind of Conan stuff.
Perfect. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
That was one of the nicest parts of that. Well, I don't mean these all sound like backhanded compliments.
No, it's all good.
That part of the book. That was a good part of the book. I really thought that was
like No Road Home. I grabbed a lot of floor on that one. Like so that middle section with Conan is almost all mine, and the big reveal at the end, the house of the House of Ideas, that was actually my idea. The climax of the book, I figured that all out, which I'm really proud of. But I thought, okay, that's my chance to write Conan. I knew Jason was launching the book, and that would kind of be that. He was doing the monthly book. And then they did that Savage Sword series, which was almost anthology style, where different creative teams were rotating in on it. And I thought, oh crap, I could finally write instead of co-writing, no offense to Gail and no offense to Mark or Al, I really would love to have a Conan story with just my name on it, on the writing credit.
That's reasonable.
In the classic Hyborian age, no crossovers, no superheroes, just like pure sword and sorcery badassery. And so I pitched an idea to Mark Basso, the editor, for this story that ended up being called The Gambler. And it's a 3-part story in Savage Sword. And that was my mic drop. That was like, this is what I think Conan is. And this is why I think he's cool. And this is what a Conan story is supposed to feel like. And Pat Zerker drew it, did a great job. It's Conan in this gambling hall where you can literally gamble your life away. And he's like out of his depth. And at any moment he could get slain. And, you know, there's monsters and dancing pretty girls and assassins. And it's just like pure, you know, Robert E. Howard-esque stuff, but I'm not copying one story directly. I'm sort of just taking little bits and pieces of ingredients of things I liked from Roy and things I liked from Robert, you know, a little bit of Kurt Busiek, and like, this is what I think Conan is. And it went over really, really well. The readers liked it. Mark, my editor, liked it, and Conan Properties loved it. They thought it was super cool. We introduced a card game in the story called Serpent's Bluff, and they're now turning that into an actual Conan card game.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah, which is super fun, you know, and I was like really kind of thrilled about that. And so when I finished handing in The Gambler, Mark turned around and said to me, hey, we want to do more stuff with the Robert E. Howard properties. We're, you know, talking to the Conan Properties people about expanding our license. Solomon Kane, Dark Agnes, these other characters in the canon we want to do stuff with. Are you interested in writing a crossover? And they were like, it would be ideal if we had a Marvel connection. Mm-hmm. And so I brainstormed over like 3 or 4 days. I brainstormed what would become Serpent War. And I wrote that crazy crossover book, and Moon Knight's in it. And so I teed up some stuff that some of the stuff that Jason was going to do in the Avengers story, where Khonshu and all those sorts of things that were happening. And it was just a really, really fun ride. And when I handed in that first script, I really blew it out, big narrative, crazy stuff. And it got handed into Mark, my editor. And then he, a couple days later, called me and offered me the regular book. He said, you know, Jason's wrapping up his run on Conan. Your Conan Properties number one choice. You're my number one choice. Do you want the book? It came out of nowhere for me. I actually didn't say yes on the spot, believe it or not. I said, give me 24 hours.
Cool.
I am kind of overwhelmed. At the time I was doing Black Panther and the Agents of Wakanda. I was doing Iron Man with Dan. I was doing D&D stuff and a bunch of D&D consulting. I'm still teaching. Mm-hmm. My plate was surged full. And so I was kind of like, this is a dream book for me, but I don't want to mess it up. I've got to make sure I make room for this. And so I called up Tom and said, I need to leave Iron Man. Like, that was the book that I could leave. Do you know what I mean? Like a co-writer credit versus a solo credit.
Yep.
Iron Man's a great character and I love the character, but Conan, man, like I got to do this.
You can't turn down Conan.
Right. For me in particular, that was a dream book. Tom was so supportive, super cool, no problem. And that's the reason why Christos Gage ended up coming on to co-write with Dan. Right. So, and I've been doing Conan, ever since, which has been a real thrill.
And you're going to hit the 300th issue here. And
yes, issue 25 is Legacy 300. Yeah.
Yeah. I like. Yes, 25, 300. This is in September or October.
September is going to be the Legacy 300. I'm a Legacy number nerd. I love the Legacy numbers. So if you go to my website and you look on my bio and it says the books I've written, they're always the Legacy numbers instead of the right
numbers, as you might say.
Right, as we would say, as you and I, collector nerds would say, the correct number. So like my Avengers runs, both No Surrender and No Road Home are the Legacy numbers, and that's just for my own satisfaction.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's funny because there was such a battle. Felt like 5-6 years ago it seemed to come to a head, and but online. But inside the comic shop, it was a fun thing for people to debate, but people didn't really seem to care. I mean, they were buying the comics either way. They just enjoyed the debate of it.
What do you think, Joe, like about the legacy numbers versus the, all that stuff?
I feel like it's like they got themselves in a hole they never had to be in.
Yeah,
like
I get that.
They could have never, and I mean the collective they, because it's not one company, it's both.
No.
DC do this. It's instead, and it felt like then they started to solve problems that weren't there by creating the point ones, the A's, and stuff like this. And it's just it wouldn't have been that hard. And I think part of it is just keeping that faith, because now we see like Spawn 300 did really well.
Sure.
And there was a long stretch of time where it didn't.
Right. But
it wasn't resetting the number that did anything. It was, adding new variant covers, exciting people again through other means.
And the creative teams obviously is the biggest, quote a bumper you can do to it. Oh, yeah. The only thing that kills me is, now annuals are not annuals. Like that's the only thing that makes me sad, where I'm like, I liked the annual as a format. I thought it was really neat, and that you could count on it every year. And whether or not you call them by the numbers, and originally they were just numbered, or you call it by the year it comes out, I felt like there was something to celebrate there, something fun. And now they're just weird special issues that get sort of thrown against the wall. And I think it's a disservice to the people doing those books, because I don't think that they're bad books by any means.
No.
There was an advantage that I had. So when I was doing Champions, we had that new character, Snowguard, the Canadian superhero that we created, and there was quite a bit of buzz about her. And I knew that we didn't really have space in the schedule to tell a solo story. And I was like, there's a lot of buzz. If we did an annual, I could focus on her. And they were like, yeah. And all of a sudden we got it added to the schedule. So I had like an extra issue of Champions that I could flex on in an area that I wanted to explore, but that we didn't kind of have space for in the monthly,
Yeah.
I mean, I think Joe's got it right. It created a problem that wasn't necessary to some extent.
Yeah. And the biggest problem is that it's tough. I feel bad for all kinds of, people in marketing, people on retail, people on the creative teams. Like everyone wants to be on a rocket ride. Everyone wants to be on a book that's got momentum. If a book hasn't been around in years, how are the Ducks coming back? You're not going to call it issue number whatever the next in order, right? Like you kind of got to call it a number one. Sure. But how much time is too much, and in order to hit that button, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so there's all sorts of exceptions to the rule. Like if you brought back She-Hulk, you're not going to continue the John Byrne numbering, or even the Dan Slott numbering. It's been a long time since there was a She-Hulk book. Okay, is that justified? Well, why that, but not something else? Like it's weird, right?
Yeah. I think the main thing, like I think of, at least when we're talking about this, is when the numbering goes back to number one and a month has not been missed.
Sure.
And
I get that.
That's so often. And it'll be like, we're back to one, legacy numbering for the anniversary issue. We're back to number one, and like that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And in Skull Kickers, we made fun of that. I don't know if you remember.
Yes, we did.
This was our fourth story arc, and our numbers had, sunk as a creator-owned book in its fourth story arc. It's tough to stand out. And so there was a jokey book, and I said, let's do a new number one for 5 months in a row. And the nice thing about Image Comics is you are in control. You are the creator. And Eric Stevenson was like, be careful, you're going to get a lot of flack. And I was like, I'm planning on it. Like I just went in, so we did this press release that was very much in the style of all the reboot number one kind of things. And people laughed because we were calling it the Uncanny Skull Kickers, because at that point there was Uncanny Avengers, Uncanny X-Men, and there was another Uncanny book. I swear there was like 3 Uncanny books.
Yeah.
Uncanny X-Force. And so what the funniest thing happened, the week that Uncanny Skull Kickers came out, I could never have planned this. A couple of the Marvel books shipped late, and all the Uncanny books came out that week. And so there were 4 Uncanny books, and mine was the 4th one. And so a bunch of people took photos of it on the stands, and they were like, look, Zub, you're right there beside Uncanny Avengers and all this stuff. And I was laughing. I was like, this is amazing. Such good marketing for me. And then the next month we did the Savage Skull Kickers #1. And then the month after, we just did like the Mighty Skull Kickers. And we just, on the final press release, the 5th one, we actually said, we haven't beaten this horse dead yet. Like, we're just going to do it one more time, And to our credit, our sales almost doubled. It's an indie book. Like, they're not like world beater sales, but we were back in the green in a big way on that book because people thought it was really funny and they checked it out. And so it was a unique opportunity for us, but I never imagined we would be prescient, of the industry to come. And even just a couple of years later where it felt like that joke was not enough, like just wild, you know what I mean? When some of the Marvel books are making fun of the same thing, like I couldn't believe it,
For all you people who comment on this every time, look at this, you're buying the book, you're doing this to yourselves. What are you doing?
Well, and I actually did a blog post about those relaunches, and I kind of said, I feel guilty because I make fun of this thing and we just benefited from it. Like, oops, here we go. That's why they do it, guys. It was wild. It was a weird scene,
So I've got to ask, in terms of, kind of big announcements and, you've got a new book coming out.
Yes.
Avengers Tech On. And
we just announced it. Yeah.
6 issues, right?
Yep. 6-issue miniseries. So much fun.
How did this come about? And then I got a question for you after that. But how did this begin?
So Tech on Avengers is a really funky book because it's a partnership between Bandai Japan and Marvel. Marvel's brand has been growing so huge in Asia. The movies are massive and everything else. And a lot of companies want to obviously get involved with Marvel stuff. CB Cebulski, for a long time, he was in Asia doing sales and development and things like that before he became editor-in-chief. And so he's got a lot of great relationships over there as well. And so Bandai's working on this toy line. There's this, I think it's called SF Figuarts. They're these amazing detailed posable figures that are produced. And they got this really hot designer over there to come up with these brand new kind of armor designs as if every Avenger was wearing Iron Man armor, sleek and awesome, looks like just Ultraman by way of Evangelion kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they had a sort of a base sort of idea of a story, but they weren't sure how, where it could go exactly. And I got recommended for the project. And helped kind of flesh it out, build out a bunch of that world. And then we're doing this tie-in comic that is going to be pushed really heavily alongside the toys. And those toys are going to come out in North America and all over the world. And like Bandai did a big press announcement like 2 days ago, and they did this like live stream, and tons of toy collectors and comic book heads in Japan were watching this thing. They're showing off the prototypes of the toys. They're showing off pages from the comic. We needed to do the comic really far ahead of time. So I'm actually in the midst of writing the final issue already. And the art is done for issue 3 now. And so they can use that art on marketing and on promotion. There's particular pages that they're going to be doing, posters and all sorts of funky inserts and all kinds of cool things with that we've kind of built into the whole marketing strategy for it. So it's a really unique opportunity. I get to play in this like kind of tokusatsu world. Like, if you guys don't know the term, I'm sure you do, Perch, but it's like these Joe, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Explain anyway.
It's like Power Rangers and Kamen Rider, Masked Rider, and all these sorts of shows. They're like the kind of fun, colorful, over the top action adventure shows in Japan. And they've got a kind of a language of their own, and they're like big and dramatic and over the top and colorful and ridiculous and joyous. They're really joyous adventure. You know what I mean? And I wanted to bring some of that kind of quality, like a bit of a Power Rangers quality, to the Avengers. And so the villains are way over the top and the monsters are crazy. The artist we've got on the series is this guy, Jeff Cruz. His nickname is Chamba, and he does every frame looks like it's from an animated movie. Like he does this beautiful kinetic artwork, gorgeous and colorful. I've been a fan of his for years. We worked together back in the day at the Udon studio. And when Tom brought me this thing and he said, tech on, and this is what it all entails. I said, I know the guy who needs to draw this. And, Tom was like, well, we don't know what what Bandai's going to want. And I'm like, they'll love it. Trust me. I brought Jeff in, and Jeff did a test page, and the test page is literally the first image that they used in the marketing. Like that's how on the money it was. I knew he was the right guy for the job, and he's been just knocking it out of the park every single day on those pages. They're gorgeous.
Now, this is a standalone, kind of sits in its own pocket universe, right? This isn't.
Yeah, we're referencing some current Marvel continuity because that was something Bandai wanted. They wanted it to be like plugged into the Marvel universe, but it's not affecting the current continuity, right? Gotcha. So like Thor is in there wearing his current costume because they were like, well, that's what Thor looks like. And I'm like, exactly. So, that's cool. And all that kind of stuff. But it is its own sort of little pocket and tons of fun. You can get away with so much when you have your own, it's like Tom Taylor's doing Injustice. You don't have to worry about what's happening in Superman. You know what I mean? Like, or Deceased or something like that. It's a fun kind of self-contained space where you can stretch out and kind of go buck and have fun with it. And so we can do some crazy stuff you couldn't normally get away with. And yeah, it's just been a real joy to be a part of. And then to see that, I think these toy collectors and a bunch of people, if you love Power Rangers or any of that kind of stuff, I think it's going to do well with retailers. I think it's going to do well with a different part of the market, hopefully. They're doing some really smart branding. Like the main cover of the series is the exact same imagery they're using on the packaging for the toys. So good. You can shelve them together and be like, you got a one-on-one, like, go get it,
Yeah.
Now, will they put a trade together in a Tankobon style?
I don't know about any of that end of things. There was man.
Come on, Marvel.
If we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, I would love to go to Japan and see right now in Akihabara, there were some people taking photos. They have the prototypes in glass cases in Akihabara showing them off. So hundreds of thousands of people are walking by it every day and seeing the big promo and seeing Chamba's artwork and stuff. Like Bandai's putting some muscle behind it. It's very encouraging,
I said it right. Yeah, no, I Yodobashi camera, I think has.
Yes.
Yodobashi,
exactly. No.
Very, very cool. Come on out with a Tankobon style book. Come on, Marvel.
That would be cool, right? Yeah, the response from Bandai has been amazing. The fans have been really excited about those toys. Like, I'm not a huge toy collector personally, and I'm like, man, if I was, I'd be freaking out, But as a kid, I would have lost my mind. These things look so badass, and they're super posable, and it just looks like a good time, you know. As much as I do love writing in the main Marvel universe and all the continuity and all that entails, there is a joy to be able to just kind of play with the toys off in their own kind of space and bust it out,
People, and you dispelled it, I think, in kind of walking through how this came about. But there's been some comments that these kinds of things are a response. It's basically Marvel trying to fend back the invasion of Demon Slayer and My Hero Academia. But
I don't know, but is
X-Men, like
is X-Men Demon Days a cool book? Yeah.
Sure.
It's a great book. And if that's done well for you in your store, why wouldn't you want more of those? Like, why wouldn't you want more cool,
Yeah, I mean, is it that weird to say, hey, if something is popular, then you want to try and get on that train? Like, it's not.
Marvel Zombies did really well for some kooky reason. People were into zombies, like that. Tell a cool, story. Like, that's kind of the whole point of the thing. Like, yes, you can do really bad trend hopping, or you can try and find a new niche and kind of push into that space and do something cool with it.
Yeah, I mean,
or do the Marvel Mangaverse again.
So the Marvel Mangaverse is such a weird thing because Udon was part of that. That was before I came on board the studio. And it's like, you could tell which books were there was heart behind it, and which ones were sort of like cold formulas that were being plugged into,
sure,
spaces on it. Yeah,
I've been Dunn's old friend, so that's a
like Scotty Young kind of had his almost breakout there, if I'm not mistaken. I think some really good stuff came from that. Mm-hmm. Even if some of it you looked at and you go, "Ooh, that's kind of been photocopied through the photocopier too many times." And it's really about. I think a lot of people get this about fantasy as well. Kind of tying it back to some of the earlier things we said, I've heard a lot of people, they'll say like, oh, if the first thing they've ever seen is Game of Thrones, or they went to see the Lord of the Rings movies and they don't realize the depth and breadth of fantasy literature or sword and sorcery or pulp or any of those things, you can come in and do a real surface level pastiche and think you're doing something cool. But man, people were telling these stories, or that story you think is innovative, they did it 40 years ago. You know what I mean? Or you can come in with an open mind to learn and do something really cool and dig deeper, or be a genuine fan of the thing. Like, a lot of people have told bad Conan stories, and it's not because they don't like Conan. It's just maybe all they know is the Arnold movies, and they read a couple issues of Savage Sword, and that's as deep as it goes. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that they're bad stories, but a lot of times they're falling into cliches that have been done a million times before. And you got to kind of go, look, man, it's like doing a Batman story where he's punching out a mugger in an alleyway. You're like, snore. What's like we've seen, or yes, he's perched on the gargoyle. That is the cliche. But now what do you got? Like, what else can you bring to the table?
I don't think it's so weird. I was surprised a little bit at kind of some of the negativity around these kinds of efforts, because a lot of what customers and readers want is, they're like, the company should be responsive to things.
Right.
Like, the company should be giving, fantasy's popular. We like to see fantasy stuff. So it's like, you're getting what you're asking for.
What you ideally need to do, and the smartest thing for an editor to do, is to cast creative talent that is going to bring something more than just
for sure
a baseline hit across. Oh, you want My Hero Academia? I can do that, and they just like do a very bare bones one for one copy or whatever. Oh, Dragon Ball's hot with the kids, I'll do a Dragon Ball. You're like, no, you gotta think more. You gotta say, why do people like that? Why do they think it's so cool? And not just transplant the tropes, but also try and dig below the surface, right?
It's it fits really well. We Joe and I actually talked to Kari Andrews yesterday, and he of course got this amazing fantasy series comes out that
looks so cool.
It's I think it's going to be a fun time. We've got a really good mech story, we got a fantasy story, we got Tula. This is a nice time to be reading comics.
These characters are bigger than the current continuity. Batman. There's a reason why those Elseworlds were so awesome, because you can put him in the Victorian era, you can put him in a vampire story, you can put them in and we want to see how the thing we know kind of reacts and changes when you push it up against different ingredients, right? Yeah. I think if you're smart about it, or you can come in and do the most bare bones, obvious, version.
It tends to be forgotten very quickly,
right? And that's the thing.
If you're lucky, maybe it tends to be
right. Or it hangs around your neck for all time. But I ideally, it's not like I'm expecting people to go, Avengers Tech On is the deepest story and I wept openly or whatever. But they're like, what we love by what we're showing off, and what our influences are. We're wearing it on our sleeve, and come in with a good time. And I think you're gonna love it, because what we're going for, and what the possibilities are inherent in that kind of story. And that's what I'm trying to do. I think the same kind of thing happened with like Heroes Reborn. Like, everyone, if you come in with your preconceived notions and you're like, oh man, Jason Aaron's doing DC stuff, you're like, yeah, but he's doing these fun kind of takes and alternate sort of spins. And if you come in with an open mind, I think you'll be surprised how some of it synergizes in fun ways. Or you can just sling mud at everything because
that's the cool thing to do online, I hear.
Yeah, and it's not to say that therefore you can never be negative or you can never be critical, but if it's just knee-jerk responses before you even read it, that's the stuff that drives me a little crazy.
Yeah. I miss, and this would take us into a complete rabbit hole, but I'll deal. But I miss that. there was a time, I mean, because a lot of where I come to, to Twitter or to YouTube or whatever else, it's trying to recreate a feeling that I had in a comic shop where people would have arguments, but you weren't punching somebody in the.
They were kind of playful. I think. You'd be like, "You're reading that book," and you're like, "Yeah, man, it's awesome." And they're like, "Okay," and you sort of laugh it off, and people collect what they're going to collect, and the Marvel DC schism runs deep, and you all laugh it off.
Exactly. Yeah. There was these kinds of debates, and what I struggle with a lot, and I want it to happen, and I don't think it can now, but I want those fun arguments to take place online and not turn into World War III. I think
I think the biggest problem with a lot of online discourse is because the majority of, if it's Twitter, for example, it's text-based, so there's no context, right? Sarcasm doesn't come across, or, particularly subtweeting, where it's like, you're not reading the jokes that led to the thing. All you're reading is the reactionary flip out or whatever, you know? And it's really easy to get pulled into a vortex as a reader. It's easy to get pulled into a vortex as a creator. And I've seen creators, dear friends of mine, colleagues, end up getting in these scraps with people with 20 followers, and they're going to pour hours of their life into this and gnash their teeth and rend their garments. They're flipping out. And I kind of go, man, this is not a productive use of your time. And I would love to say, and therefore I will stand above the fray. And a few times, I've been pulled into some of these little arguments, and 8 people can feel like a pile-on. If they're rapid fire sending you anger or frustration, and you're trying to justify yourself in the moment, and you're hitting send, and you're like, no, you're wrong, or, and you've got the gotcha, and 8 people rapid fire hitting you up, and your notifications are going off, it's really easy to say, well, I would never. Well, I would never let myself get into an argument with 7 follower number idiot, whatever. And you're like, and then all of a sudden you're getting pelted, and you go, screw you, man. And a few times it's like, it sounds corny, but have to physically put down the phone or walk away because you're like, this is not right. This is not healthy. And so I have empathy on all kinds of sides of these things. And that makes me, maybe I'm a fence sitter or whatever you want to call it, but it's like, I understand the passion of the fans and why they freak out on a bunch of things. I understand the creators who feel like they're being rained upon, or in that moment, they, something as simple as a serialized story, and you're midway through and the fans have decided you're a piece of garbage, and you're like, you're midway through, right? You know that the other side, there's probably light on the end of these stories most of the time. I hate to tell you, I don't want to spoil it, but
sometimes the hero has to fail a bit.
And that's not to say that every story is going to stick the landing or anything else, right? But it can be hard. It can be hard to fight back that urge. And so, but on the other hand, I'm sort of, there are times where I'm noticing now more and more, I have been able to sort of stop myself, where it's this is today's flip out. No one needs my opinion on fill in the blank. So I can speak specifically about one because it directly pertains to me. Okay.
Sure.
Excellent.
So the people were flipping out on Dan Slott because he did that Marvel's documentary about
Yes.
And Christos Gage was the co-writer, and they interviewed him, and Tom, and they created that fictional flow of how an issue of Iron Man gets made. And everyone's putting on a big guffaw, weird thing, and they're all making fun of Dan because he's a lazy and last-minuting the whole thing. And there were parts of it where I know Dan and I know Tom. I literally know everyone in that damn special. And I know they're not actors, and they're not, they're putting on a goof, and it's not quite coming across to people the way that it's intended. Or if you're not in the know, it's not playing properly, right? And then Dan's getting defensive, and everyone's freaking the hell out. And people raining crap down on Dan and saying, well, you're just crapping it out, and your coworkers do all the work, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, look, I don't get involved in these phrases, but I have literally just been Dan's co-writer. I literally was doing the job that Christos Gage is doing in that special. And if Christos Gage says it, you feel like he has a vested interest because he's the guy on the camera.
Yep.
So I feel like I can come in relatively pure, like not perfect. Obviously I have biases. Oh, Jim. And I come in and I say, that is, you are projecting. Dan is a professional. Dan delivers the goods. Is Dan perfect? No. Am I perfect? No. But Dan had the whole story built. I know he did because I knew the whole story 8 months in advance.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so even in the special, when they're talking about him kind of on the fly making it up, I cringe at that because I could see how people were mistaking it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh man. And there's also an element of it where just in general, this is my own bias. Okay. I am not a fan of those stories where a slacker wins everything. Like I hate those movies. I hate those stories. And that I know a lot of them are really well done. They're very funny, but when I'm watching them, it always drives me a little crazy that the character who does the least gets the most. And I'm sure I could sit down with a therapist and they would go, the reason why is because, or whatever, but it's pretty obvious. I work very hard. I'm Canadian. Because I work very hard and I feel like there should be some balance between the work put into something versus the reward you receive. Is the real world like that? No, not all the time. But on the whole, I have seen a lot of examples that it is, right? And when you sell the slacker superhero, when you sell the idea of someone who gets everything for nothing, you are creating an image in people's minds that is not healthy, I think. And so comic book creation gets so few platforms to be shown to the general public. The characters get all these platforms, but the people, at best you'll have a documentary in the making of, and one of the writers shows up for 30 seconds and goes, I love writing Daredevil or whatever, you know what I mean? And then it's like, go to the actor, go to the director, go to the special effects guy,
Here's your $200, Ed Brubaker.
Right, whatever. Like the comic people don't get those kinds of opportunities to speak about their craft almost ever. And then to have one of those few opportunities come across like, it just happens. And I was like, get it.
So, I mean, people know I did a video on this thing when it came out, and it's refreshing because I had the same take as you, which was my overall thought was like, the person I was mad at was not Dan Slott.
Right.
It was, who was the maniac who edited this thing that blew this opportunity? And it's, I don't think
you've got to keep in mind the people that are putting that show together, they're probably not diehard comic book fans. They're there to make entertaining television, right?
Exactly.
And so if you have 4 takes and you have the one that's the most entertaining one, even if it's the one that makes people look, bumbling or whatever you want to call it, like that's the difficult part of the thing. Right?
Well, it was meant. I don't believe the number of people speculated. Who did Dan Slott piss off at the Marvel Studios?
Right.
But it's more. I think there was a narrative they came in with, like, hey, these guys are kind of jokey. Let's do it kind of jokey, and look, Dan Slott's messing around at the beginning and just distracting.
But I think anyone with a camera in front of you, I think people are surprised how you can change if you've never done a lot of public speaking and all of a sudden literally the spotlight's on you. You feel like you have to be more of yourself. You have to like turn everything up to 11.
Yep.
And I could see those traits. Like I could see Tom being extra Tom and Dan being extra Dan. And I was just like, I know these people and they're dear friends and I respect them. And it's like, oh man, this is a weird ride. Like, and I want the best for everyone. And I want everyone to walk away from something like that and go, oh man, making comics is cool and amazing. Yeah. And there were moments like when Dan's signing at the end and he's interacting with the fans and they're super excited to meet him. And even as staged as bits as that were, like that's very pure and there's something very joyous there, Yeah,
the camera was further back. Yeah, it did play off. I want us to be at a place, and I think it's a fool's errand, but I want us to be at a place where people can watch that and go, well, that didn't work. And not have it turn into an attack on Dan. Not for Dan to feel like he has to come in and start clubbing people.
Well, I think it's also this weird thing where, it's one of those classic Venn diagrams where people just projected whatever they already thought on top of it.
Well, sure.
Of course, yeah.
And so it's one of those rare occurrences where I got involved in a conversation online because I felt like I had knowledge that directly pertained to the circumstances and could ideally shed some light on a thing.
But that's like listen to you.
Actually, it wasn't completely a waste. Like some people came away a little, I can't say that I turned the tide for them or whatever, but it was like, I always try to be honest. You know what I mean? Sometimes I guess to a fault, but I try and say, this is the reality of it, and some of it's good and some of it's bad and some of it's difficult and some of it's stressful, but it's still writing comics and it's still a lot of fun on the whole,
Yeah. I feel like, and this is like, this isn't related, Dan, this is just hypothetical.
Yeah.
Thing. But like, kind of what goes into this, I think what causes some of the frustration is, again, it's the Wild West. No one knows what the hell they're really doing on social media to a certain extent.
Right.
So like, I think you see, like you were saying, like you might get a creator or anyone someone involved in comics, someone people know, that end up wasting like 4 hours arguing with someone with 20 or less followers. That's just like a bot account. And then someone who is actually either a fan or likes their work, like might chime in and be like, oh, well, I normally really like your stuff, but I really don't like how you portrayed Stephanie Brown and blah, blah, blah. And then the person's just so upset. They're like, blocked. That's it. Through you. And it's like, you were arguing with a no faith, like jerk who just wanted to rise.
But now you're wound up. And everything's an attack, right? And there's also people who are coming in under all sorts of false pretense, or there's people who are genuinely watching you flip out and everything else, right?
Well, and enjoy getting you to that place. I mean,
because here's the reality of it: if you're, I don't know, Sunglasses 86 or whatever, you get to carry on your regular life at the end of this. You get to leave Twitter, go get dinner, and carry on, right? But whoever the professional is now and I use this sparingly because I know I'm not trying to say a celebrity, but you're a public figure in the sense you're a known real human being whose real name is being used on your account, right? Like I'm not going to get recognized on the street, but at the end of the day, also my name is associated directly with my Twitter account and my social media. So if I say something stupid, it gets pinned on me, and you get to say all kinds of stupid things and it doesn't get pinned on you. And it becomes, and that's not to say, oh, woe is me, poor comic book writer being pelted by the fans. It's just, it's a weird dynamic.
And people forget in the middle of all this is, and Sean Murphy did a really good point on his talk about social media. It's people forget there's another entity, there's a third party here, which is a platform itself that has a vested interest in poking everyone with that stick and keeping you going. All the language they use around blocking and everything else is designed to be antagonistic on purpose because that equals more engagement. So even a normal argument is you're debating it in a vehicle where.
And that's why, like, the vast majority of my social media is about promoting my stuff, talking about things I love, joking about things that I like, whatever, retweeting cool art, telling people excitedly about stuff either I've got going on or people that I respect and love their stuff, joking with my friends and peers in a almost universally positive way. Like it's like trying to be the best version of myself on those things, because the little filter in the back has to be the one time you're not, and it's not like I've been perfect. That's the one they're going to screenshot. That's the one they're going to hold over your head. You know what I mean? So even, this last year has been a meat grinder for all of us, obviously. And there were a few times like I got really frustrated about Canada's rollout of the vaccine. You know what I mean? And then a few hours later, it's like, I got that out of my system. I'm going to delete those tweets. Not because it's like I'm haunted by them and it's the end of the world, but it's like, I kind of don't need to talk about that publicly. That's not the purpose.
Yeah.
I've got a good friend in the comic book industry, and I won't call him by name or whatever. And he and I actually call each other up every so often, and we jokingly call it filling the venom bucket.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, do you ever see on those nature specials where they will press the fangs of the snake against the edge of the bucket and the venom will come out? So it's like we're pressing our teeth against the edge of a bucket and you're getting it out of your system.
That's healthy on the phone.
Yeah.
That's better. Yes.
And you're like, and it's private. It's the two of us. And you're just like, oh my God, this angers me so much. Or I don't know why the industry is this way, or this interaction I had is so weird, or these social media thing happened, or all that sort of stuff. And trying as hard as possible not to hit the send button and do it in a public way. You know what I mean?
Sure. I mean, I have people I do that with too. And I wonder, and Perch and I'll also discuss, we'll see some of these insane tweets that end up, trending and all that. And, we'll just sort of be like, do these people not have like a friend or someone to just call and talk to about some of this stuff?
Yeah. Like, and you don't know, you don't, and I think that's where having those kind of spaces to vent, or having someone, and it can be tough because, they'll say, well, talk to someone who's not in the industry. And you're like, it is nice to have someone who knows what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's one thing to tell random, even if they're your friend, the amount of backstory you got to get into it. And yet I think there are times when it's healthy to tell outside people, because they can also give you some context where they go, you know what, this doesn't matter. And you're like, you're right. And I couldn't put that, I literally couldn't agree with you until you told me that. Yeah. Like I couldn't see it, forest for the trees. Every so often my wife does a phenomenal job of bringing me back to earth on stuff. I'll be super stressed about a thing I'm working on or trying to figure something out. And it's genuinely important to me to do a good job and all that stuff. Sure. And then she'll say to me, and yet you're still writing the Avengers. And you're like, and yet I'm still writing the Avengers. You know what I mean? And yet tomorrow you're getting on a conference call with Wiz of the Coast or whatever. You know what I mean? And it's not to say that she doesn't care or that she's not empathetic. She's just like reframes that moment and goes, is this as apocalyptic as it feels in that moment? No.
You need a support mechanism that's going to help you. And then
every so often, if you're going to send an email to a colleague or a peer or unload a fireball on someone, like you need a safety valve. You need someone that you can send that and go, am I nuts or is this the right thing to, and then someone else can go, that one line there, that's going to haunt you. That's and because you are a writer, you can make words sting extra. You can really bring the damage when you want to. And every so often my wife will read an email that I'm like about to send and she goes, that's very funny. You should not send that. That is, you think you're being witty and amusing, but you're poking the bear because you can, and you're not seeing it in context. And it's not like it happens very often, but just every so often you kind of need that little safety valve or check and go, yeah, this is ridiculous. I got to just step off.
I just want to get us back to the comic book shop behavior where we can go in, we can have arguments, we can make fun of things, and nobody feels like they're getting a limb lopped off, and it can go on,
But you have a comic book store, and I know it hasn't been running normally, obviously, but it's not like that at the store.
No, and it is like, it's like what I want at the store. It's not of course. It's not like social media. It is. People can argue very heatedly, but there's not this sense of people coming to blows or saying, well, I see you standing next to that person over there, so you're my enemy too. I mean, it's but
you know why that is? It's also because you have the voice and you also have the visuals. When I can see your face, I know you're not putting acid behind those words. You're being sarcastic, and then we laugh it off, right? But if it's just straight cold text, I think that's where
it goes away, and everybody will interpret it in their own filter. And if you're already heated, you're going to read it hotter, and that's the problem. And so it's something that we can't really unwind back, but it does. So many of these conversations, the outrage, the other things, feel just so point. Like this, we did not need to do this.
and there's something about having discourse in a store. Well, it would being face to face with someone, has a lot to do with that. But I mean, like you'd go to shops and talk to people, and you could have these conversations, and people could even like kind of be, maybe like disparaging a creator to a certain extent, but people would go back and forth. You'd get people who are like, Jonathan Hickman, and then they'd be like, what are you talking about? I've been a fan since Nightly News. And like, you'd get that. And like, there was nothing like really nasty about it. But for whatever reason, when it comes on like, social media, it comes off so nasty.
Yeah. And social media has been extremely valuable to my career. Mm-hmm. And I've made deep friendships and bonds with other creators that would never have been possible. You know what I mean? Yep. And so you have this weird love-hate thing where you're like, I would never have gotten to know a bunch of these respected people in the business or felt like I was part of this bigger thing as much if I didn't have this. Yeah. And yet, you know what I mean? There's always that, it can snap back on you, or it has such a weird duality to it, particularly when things turn heated. For sure. Comics has such a chip on its shoulder about its place in the entertainment canon, and now more than ever because we're seen as the platform for television and movies instead of viable in our own right. But the downside of that is a lot of the people in this business seem to forget that they are part of a broader entertainment blanket. And so I'll see creators taking wild pot shots about TV and movies. And it's like, I know you're pitching your stuff in Hollywood. I know. And that's not to say never be negative or never be critical or whatever else. Just don't shit where you eat. Like, for God's sake, man, like you don't know. Perfect example. So I am just getting started at the Udon studio, and I go to a couple conventions, and I'm out for dinner with a bunch of professionals it was like some role-playing game people and board game designers and a couple comic people. It's just like a real dog's breakfast of creatives. And we're sitting around the table chatting, and the subject comes up, who's the worst art director you've ever worked for, or worst editor? And these just heinous, brutal stories are coming around, like just vicious people tearing stuff down. And I'm like loving it. Oh man, everyone's spilling the tea. This is the greatest thing ever. And then I've got an art director in my head that we had worked for a client, and they were just hell on wheels and didn't know what they wanted. And the reference was awful. And they were just, screwing us over left, right, and center. And I'm like, I'm going to be part of it. This is going to be so fun. I'm going to tell my story. And I was like building up my excitement. And two people before me brings up that person's name. And the person in between the two of us goes, that guy was my best man at my wedding. Yeah. You're a piece of shit. And they just have it out. And it literally right beside me, like no exaggeration. And I thought to myself, that would have been me. Like I would have.
You dodged a bullet, yeah.
I absolutely. It could not have been more dramatically. It's ridiculous. And I thought to myself, and of course the whole conversation broke down, and everyone stopped talking about that. And I thought, I have learned something this day, and I will put that away in my mind and never forget it. Yeah. Someone that you're taking pot shots at, someone that you're taking a dump on, that's their best friend, probably also works in the industry. They were someone's best man. They were someone's, whatever. You do not know, man. You do not know. And so why are you just, salting the earth? I don't get it.
I don't like the if we got onto this, I thank you for being so candid with us on this.
No problem.
I think it's something I want people to hear this, because I think there is this big misunderstanding of us versus them, and I think these kinds of conversations help. Like when we talk to Jeff and Sean and others about it, it's there's this odd pass it forward kind of behavior, and it's like, hey, these customers are attacking me. I don't like it. I'm going to attack the person in the TV business in the same heat, and it's like all we're doing is passing up this negativity up the chain.
Well, and I get it in the sense of you're punching upwards, so you feel like you're
Yeah, you're justified. It's up.
You're justified. Yeah, well, movies are huge and TV's huge, and you know, sure, but you just never know. I think it's just foolish in general. Does that mean that I love every movie? No, of course not. Probably the easiest way to tell if I don't like something is if I'm not talking about it ever. You know, if you're like, geez, Jim never talks about that movie, and you're like, that's not to say I've seen every movie, but it's like,
sure,
if everyone and their dog is railing on something, I probably hated it too. I just don't need you to know that.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
But you know, you brought up something important though when you're talking about that discussion at the table and the person being very defensive of the other person. Like, I do think, like, yes, of course, people are going to react that way, but I think we would all benefit if we were in that position and someone tells a story about, like, this person, like, did this awful thing to try to understand that.
Oh, sure. Empathy all around, right?
Yeah, because, like, my experience with someone, especially if they're my friend, they're not going to treat me horribly. Right. You know, like in that way, but maybe they do that to other people. And you know, I don't mean to get too dark here or anything. Sure. But
your classic sort of, well, they were always nice to me, so they must be nice.
Yeah. And like, you know, this is how we got in a position where Eddie Berganza was at DC for as long as he was. Not literally that dinner you had.
Right. No, you know, but people, you know, throwing up defenses or hiding people within these systems where they're able to, they can, you know, well, they've always been nice to me, so therefore I will never say a disparaging word or listen to anything you have to say, right?
Yeah.
And you know, it sort of ties back into what I was saying before about because comics have a chip on their shoulder. There's also this weird sense of we can be the bad boys, or we can not have to follow the rules or not be corporate, you know, stick your middle finger up and whatever. And it's like, that'll cost you at some point. Like you can do that and you totally should, but don't whine about it later if it comes back to bite you. And I feel like there are people who want it both ways. They want to be able to give the middle finger to authority, to the fans, to the corporate structure, to the entertainment business and all these things. And they're the same people who will get super upset when they're passed over. And you're like, well, why did you think that was happening? Yeah. Like, what did you think was going to happen? You know? And it's not to say that therefore you can never say a disparaging word about anyone or anything. It's just like, pick your battles, man. Like, decide what's worth the time and the effort and what you think you're going to get from it, you know?
That's very well said. Jim, I want to thank you. We went to 2 hours on a number 2.
Oh my gosh, it was crazy.
I hope at some point you find yourself in Japan and I'm there too, and we can go to Nakano Broadway and
oh my gosh, that'd be so amazing. I miss Japan so much. Last time we went was 2018, and all of our plans around 2020 crumbled. But we desperately want to get back. My wife and I love it. I've been there obviously multiple times, research for Wayward, and just because I love the country, love the people, love the food and the travel. It is like a longing. Like it's kind of crazy how much I do miss it. Yeah. Conventions in general. I know some people are disparaging of those as well, but I miss the con family. I miss that feeling of camaraderie that comes from these things, and exactly what we were talking about with the comic book store stuff. Those in-person discourses are better. They really are. They really are. Yes, I have convention horror stories, and I have, you know, people who have been super weird to me in person, but they're much fewer and farther between. You know.
Yeah. I mean, you know, most of my horror stories all involve later in the evening, and people have had to they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
All right. So we've got to get over to Japan. I've got to ask. So, have you been to the Catch a Fish restaurant in Shinjuku?
I have not been to the Catch a Fish restaurant.
Nice. All right. So that's a place we got to go. So that's
man, that sounds awesome.
You catch a fish and they didn't cut it up.
It's so good.
In front of you. It's crazy.
I did do Tsukiji fish market when it was still in Tsukiji. And it was we did the like, as the fresh fish came in, we did the auction, and then all the restaurants get their fish. And then we walked back with one of the restaurateurs, and as they opened their sushi stand, we literally got the breakfast sushi, which was
amazing,
incredible. Oh my God!
The sad part is with the pandemic and everything else, that experience will not happen again now.
Yeah, none of it. Like, it's all changed, you know. Yeah. One of the things that's been super weird, I live in downtown Toronto, and in our neighborhood, you know, the neighborhood's changing so rapidly. Like, restaurants have closed down, or stores are you know, closing and changing. And we don't know, like, it's not going to completely fold up, but it's going to be different. On the other side of this, everything's going to be a little bit different. I think conventions are going to be a little bit different, and the creative process is being a little bit different. Yeah. You know, I've been teaching remotely over digital, you know, for over a year, and there are advantages and disadvantages of it, you know.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see how the entertainment industry and comics and everything else comes out of this, along with everyone else, you know.
I mean, so many experiences. I have very fond memories of restaurants in Shibuya. They're down in kind of the basement, and they're in a tiny little cell to eat, and like that's not gonna.
It's going to be a long time till that kind of thing comes back.
Yeah. Well, Jim, thank you very much for all the time tonight, and
my pleasure.
Pleasure talking to you.
Thanks. I know that you guys can get pelted by all sides at times. You know what I mean?
That's my deal. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that. Yeah, I think the discourse is valuable, even if we don't all agree. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think the worst thing to do is to close ourselves off and create a fortress and basically be like, everything is awful and let's burn it all down. Cause I don't feel like that's ever kind of healthy. You know what I mean?
No, and
yeah. But if people have listened and they've enjoyed what I've talked about, you go to my website. I've got a ton of those free blog posts about how to break into comics, how pitches are written, all those kinds of things. It would mean the world to me if people tried out Conan the Barbarian. Working on that book is an absolute dream for me. 10-year-old me would never, ever have imagined that I would have this opportunity. And I've been putting my heart and soul into it. Corey Smith, who's drawing the book, is drawing some of the best pages of his career. We're doing the big build up to issue 300. And I think it is going to be, you know, I'm a little biased, but I think it's one for the ages. And we're all super, super proud of what's being put on the page there. And I hope people give it a shot. We've got one trade paperback out now called Into the Crucible. Raj Antonio drew it. He kicked the crap out of it. It's a beauty. I've got my Savage Sword story that's in a trade paperback called The Gambler, along with other stories in there. Serpent War is another, you know, Conan book that I did that I'm really, really proud of. Avengers No Surrender, you know, Uncanny Avengers, Stars and Garters is the, trade that I did for that. No Road Home, you know, you name it, all kinds of really, really fun projects. Avengers Tech-On is coming out starting in August. The Dungeons and Dragons comics have been running since 2014, and although it hasn't been formally announced, no one is surprised to hear I've got more D&D comics in the hopper. So there's 5 trade paperbacks of that if you want to get caught up on the world's biggest and best role-playing game in comic book form. Lots of cool stuff, lots of fun things in the pipeline.
And go buy Wayward. It's out. You can get your hands on that. It's an awesome story.
Thank you. Yeah, my creator-owned books, Wayward, Skull Kickers, Glitter Bomb, and Stone Star, which actually comes out. The first trade paperback's coming out from Dark Horse in July.
Oh, wow.
Awesome. People should go check out. There's a lot of material, a lot of good things to immerse yourself in. And Jim, I hope we get to catch up with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great.